no coincidence that the southern states of what was the former Soviet Union are now military powerhouses and haters of Israel because of their religious belief of being followers of Muhammad, and they're Muslims. Additionally, Meshach, which is modern Turkey, is also going to be involved in this according to Ezekiel. And it's no coincidence that back in 2002 that Turkey elected a pro-Islamic party to govern their country. Added to that, obviously, are two other nations, Cush, Sudan, and Put, which is Libya. Now, I want you to consider this fact, folks. Just 3 years ago, this month coming up, we're not in April yet, are we? No. Just 3 years ago, in April, President Vladimir Putin made history. He was the first Russian leader to ever visit Libya. And while he's there, he creates, through many alliances and agreements and negotiations, a $2.5 billion arms agreement to arm them for an event. And guess who their enemies is? Israel. Now, this is not a coincidence. It's laying out before our very eyes. All these things are developing. Now, think about this for a second. How can you get the exact alignment of nations, exactly as Ezekiel says, showing up? This was written some 2,700 years ago, and it's happening right now on our newspapers and evening news. Incidentally, right now, if you've paid attention to the news, we're hearing about the whole Libyan regime and the attacks on one another. It's so amazing to me that just last year that Gaddafi was able to obtain a place in the UN's Human Rights Council. Why is that so hypocritical? Is because the fact is, just the last 4 years alone, the UN has had 20 of their 25 resolutions condemned Israel. Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East. Now explain that. Let me just tell you something. It's no coincidence that the scripture talks about an alignment of nations, a uniting of nations who would detest this little tiny area on the globe. This is so critical and important. You know, if aliens would come to the United States and listen to our news, they would be convinced that the whole world's being threatened by this little country, Israel. The way that Israel is painted in the news and painted in the media is that they're the ones that's causing all this problem, and that all these other people are great people. Understand, folks, Gaddafi says, all my people love me. He's convinced. He's the king of kings. What is it? It's just the spirit of Antichrist is all it is. Now, let's change pages for a second, and let me get a little foundation. And this is just the foundations. Everybody still with me? Okay. Not only is Libya, but Egypt has a major place in the scriptures. First time we hear about Egypt is when we know that Abram back then, has left the Ur of Chaldees, Babylon, Iraq, and he's coming into the promised land that God is going to show him. As he's making his journey, he runs into a famine. This man of faith, instead of believing God, goes down to Egypt. And let me tell you something. Every time you go to Egypt, you have to go down in the scripture, because it's not good. Well, long story short, it took many, many years as things developed. Some of you remember the story of Joseph, how that Abraham had his son Isaac, and then Jacob, and Jacob had his 12 sons, and one of them was Joseph. They were going to destroy Joseph. Long story short, they sell him as a slave. He ends up in Egypt as a slave under Potiphar. It's an accident, right? Just a coincidence, right? No, God had a plan. When it was all said and done, Joseph says, you know, what you caused, what you thought was destruction, ended up turning around to your all salvation. You want me to tell you the reason why? Because God is bound and determined to save Israel. He's going to use every means he can. Even wickedness, wicked man will end up bringing praise to God as a result. Well, obviously, the descendants of Jacob, who came incidentally to come and be rescued from their famine, ends up staying there. Some 400 years passes. They're in bondage and slavery to Pharaoh. You all know the story. God raises up Moses and brings great deliverance to them as they come back to the promised land, the land of Canaan, Israel. While that's going on, Jesus, who is born in Israel after God's judgment on Israel, despite all that, you all know the story. Herod's trying to kill all the babies. The angel of the Lord appears to Joseph, gives him a dream. He goes, of all places, to Egypt. Now, why? Well, one of the scriptures says that his son would come from Egypt. Well, here's the thing. It's almost as if every time the devil tries to do something, he messes it up because he ends up proving God's right. And it's going to happen again, folks, as we watch this. We're all seeing all these things happen. You think, well, you know, when you look at the overthrow of Egypt, you think that's a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. And it's not a coincidence that's happened exactly in the timing that it's happening. If anything happens as a result of this message tonight, I hope it will build in you a confidence that God is in control. Many of you remember back in 79 when Iran was our buddies. In the 70s. They were our allies, very, very good allies, and very good friends of Israel. Well, obviously as a result of what has taken place in Egypt is almost a carbon copy of what happened in Iran. The Shah started being talked bad about. Matter of fact, he was seen as a dictator and he was oppressing the people. It's the exact same story that we were hearing just a month ago with Hosni Mubarak. Exact same scenario. The amazing thing, folks, exact same month 32 years ago. Almost the exact same day. As a result, our president at that time, President Carter, said that, well, we need to hear the voice of the people. We need democracy in this country, and we have to have free and clean elections. We want to hear the people's voice. And so there was demonstrations and all the rest. Well, obviously, you all know history. If you know what happened there, you remember the Shah went into exile. The Ayatollah Khomeini took over. And guess what? America immediately becomes known as the Great Satan for the first time. And Israel was the little Satan. 52 of our Americans became hostages. And that was true until Ronald Reagan came in, the day he came into office. 444 days later, Khomeini lets him go because he knows he's messing with the wrong men now. So what's happening? It only took 1 month after the overthrow of Iran for this man to slaughter 2,000 of these people who stood for democracy, begging to be delivered from this evil dictator, the Shah, who was a friend of Israel, a friend of America, and it was like it was sending mass confusion to us here in the East, or in the West. And yet, here's the thing. Now, we're seeing all this laid out before us, and now it almost seems as carbon copy is happening again. One of the potentials, we have no idea who eventually will take over, but this is one man that they're rooting for. And the reason why is because of several interesting things. He is a defender of Iran. He is a hater of Israel, and he is a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood. Mohammed el-Bardi. The crazy thing is, this whole thing about the Muslim Brotherhood is quite scary when you consider the fact that there are Muslim Brotherhood's cell groups all through the United States of